So welcome to Julian, Taralyn, and I's presentation on systemic therapy. We decided to take a little bit of a different approach to presenting the information, more of a conversational podcast style. Um, our approach was really to go and dive into the material and then come back with what was really salient and really stuck out to us. And so each section is going to represent the things that really stuck out to us and we wanted to share with each other. I'm going to get started and then it'll go to Taralyn and then Julian. Okay, so one of the things that really excited me about systemic therapy was actually the origin story of it and the actual systems part. So thinking in systems is something that's been around for like a really long time. Like we're talking about ancient times back with the Greeks, and they used to think about the cosmos as being interconnected wholes, and they would see this from a phenomenological, experiential perspective. And then we moved on to the next epoch, which is around Newtonian mechanics and reductionism, where they were looking at reality and breaking things down into their parts, like atoms and machines. And if you think of Descartes, he viewed the human body as a machine and was breaking it down and looking at it from a systems perspective there. And then in the 20th century, there's like this big leap where that systems thinking started to move away from material properties and shifted over to like biological, environmental, cognitive, psychological, and social systems. And this is also where the fields of cybernetics and general systems theory emerged. Now, it can't be overstated how important general systems theory and cybernetics are to the scientific paradigm as a whole. So we're talking about the interdisciplinary works across all science fields, but also to the psychotherapeutic approach. It's easy to think about family systems as just interrelations between people in a family, but they really were mapping on the systems thinking onto families. So for the systemic approach with Gregory Bateson, like he was an anthropologist first and foremost, and if you read his early works, you can see him working with hunter-gatherer societies and how he looked at them and how he applied a systemic approach to them. And it's really interesting to see that in his readings. With cybernetics, we have the transdisciplinary study that examines how information is communicated and controlled with systems, whether biological, mechanical, or social, focusing on feedback loops and self-regulation to achieve stability or adaptation. So this is where the communication piece comes into systemic family approach. That we focus very much on how information is transmitted between the nodes or the members of a family. And then in the general systems theory framework, it's a study across disciplines that emphasizes universal principles of organization, interaction, and emergent properties, whether biological, social, psychological. It is the study of how parts relate to each other and how the whole system maintains itself. Okay, so next, we're going to look at the properties of systems. I find that mapping the systems perspective onto the family systems therapeutic paradigm is really important. So first, we're going to think about things in systems before we think about how they map onto the family network. So the properties of systems. One of the main things to consider is that holism and wholeness is a very important part. Systems are more than the sum of their parts. It's more than just the individual, okay? Another principle in systems thinking is interconnectedness. So the elements, whether it's people or behaviors, or if you're looking from a biological standpoint, ecosystems are linked, influencing each other through relationships. Now, I want to bring your attention to another concept, which is really important that came later. And that's the concept of distributed cognition. So it's a conceptual framework where cognitive processes are spread across individuals, tools, and environments, emphasizing how knowledge and problem solving emerge from interconnections within a system rather than residing solely in the mind. So our cognition isn't something that's just in our heads. Our cognition is something that we share amongst the people around us, around the tools that we use, and as well as with cultural artifacts. So Russell Barkley, I've talked about him before. He's our ADHD expert, or one of, has a theory that executive function evolved as a socially driven, distributed regulatory system emerging from the demands of living in cooperative groups and internalizing social feedback that guide behavior. So our executive functions emerged from how we were relating to each other. We were distributing our cognition within a bigger system, and we were developing this ability to organize, whether it's for hunting or planning, whether it's for farming and sustenance. So distributed cognition really tries to differentiate, or at least outline, how we're not just in our heads, we're distributed across people. Another property of systems is self-organization. So self-organization is the process where a system spontaneously forms ordered structures, patterns, or behaviors. The organization emerges through interactions among the system's components. So especially when we're talking about biological systems, if we think about how the environmental pressure pushes on a system, what happens is that it'll naturally emerge into a coherent cycle, into a coherent whole. And I'm going to actually connect this to something that is in person-centered therapies. Another property of systems is circular causality. So this involves co-evolving interactions where components co-determine outcomes through continuous feedback cycle. This also kind of touches on distributed cognition and that interconnectedness. Okay, so there's another aspect of circular causality, which is really important, and that's the idea of feedback loops. And these are the mechanisms or processes through which circular causality operates, the actual flow of information or influence that maintains or changes a system. So you have an output, a person receives the output, as an input, they react, they send the message back, the person reacts to that, and then what you have is you have the circular causality. And this is where how maladaptive ways of functioning can be maintained. Emergence is another really important property of systems. Emergence is the process where complex patterns, properties, or behaviors arise from the interactions of simpler elements or parts. The products or outcomes of emergence cannot be fully explained or predicted by the parts alone and depend on the nature of their interactions. When individual components interact in certain ways, they give rise to higher or lower level phenomena that have their own structural rules and functions. So the properties of a system, depending on how they interact, they can be maintained with homeostasis, or they can end up in kind of subject to entropy, where they end up in a kind of a lower order, where this entropy is the process where a system gradually loses order, organization, leading to increased disorder or breakdown over time. So you can think about how a family system can break down over time, or you have higher order processes. So this is a result of adaptation. The system adjusts in response to internal and external change. This is kind of where, this is what we're aiming for. We could aim for homeostasis after we've reached a higher order function, but we are always aiming for that emergent property systems. And there's the property of hierarchy and levels. Systems exist in layers, subsystems, and supersystems. And so you guys remember Brofenberg's ecological systems theory. And here you can kind of map an individual within broader systems, right? And how these systems impact the individual. So let's map these properties quickly onto psychotherapy. So instead of studying a person in isolation or viewing pathology as belonging to the person, system theory focuses on relationships and interactions. It looks at how behavior and context shape each other, emphasizing how the parts of the system dance together. It encourages collaboration. In terms of interconnectedness, it encourages therapists to see the client's emotional, cognitive, and social functioning as interconnected. Interconnectedness also reveals how changes in one part of the system can affect the whole, reinforcing the need for collaboration. When we think about self-organization, the introduction of adaptive strategies can increase the system's competence to self-organize. You can map the concept of self-actualization here. So when you think about self-actualization in person-centered approaches, what you're doing is you're trying to create an environment where that person self-organizes and self-actualizes and emerges into that higher order functioning, right? And by creating the conditions that allows that to happen naturally, right? Because in that therapy, we're not trying to put our own thinking in there. We're trying to allow it to emerge on its own. Now, in terms of circular causality and feedback loops, this provides a conceptual framework for viewing the circular causality between action response dynamics, patterns, and feedback loops that are maintaining maladaptive functioning. It assists in labeling the mechanisms responsible for difficulty and target the system, not just the individual. So you're targeting the in-between aspect between people. And so this really helps us kind of see it from that perspective. And then systemic therapy is based on the idea that change in the complex repeating sequences with relational groups will result in higher order organization functioning. That's what we're aiming for. And then in terms of the hierarchy and levels, systemic therapy recognizes that behavior and mental health are influenced by family, social networks, and broader systems connecting individual psychological processes to societal, cultural, and organizational contexts. Now, when we're viewing systemic therapy as a whole, systemic therapy includes a diverse set of therapeutic interventions. You have emotion-focused couple therapy, you have narrative family therapy, multi-systemic family therapy, attachment-based family therapy, structural strategic family therapy, and psychoeducational family therapy. These therapies can differ in focus. They can focus on emotion, they can focus on behavior, and they can focus on cognition. They can have different philosophical roots. It can be an objectivist standpoint or a constructivist standpoint. And they all have different intervention techniques. So they can be client-centered, they can be therapist-centric, directive, collaborative, depth-oriented, and didactic. Now, when we look at a family system, the therapist enters the system and seeks to enact change in the family. So I just have a therapist here, interacting, like this is where the magic happens, right here. It's in the in-between through questioning, reframing, communication, development, and enactment. Families can address and restructure maladaptive relational styles and relate in healthy ways. So that's the aim of the therapist, is kind of enter the system and help these communication networks so that we can emerge into a higher order functioning. And that's my piece.
Okay, perfect. So when you're reading the systems research and you're looking into what they're saying about themselves, they talk about how effective systems therapy is, how much better outcomes are compared to other therapies. But if systems therapy is so effective, why is it so rarely used? So I did one quick Google search in my city to see if I can even find anybody that practiced systems therapy. I could not find one. I found people that did family therapy, but specifically systems therapy. I could not find one person that specialized in systems therapy. And so I'm wondering again, if it's so effective, why is it not practiced? Why is it not this amazing miracle therapy that you see everywhere? Turns out there's a lot of flaws with the theory. I'm going to talk about the three that I think are the biggest flaws, and one being limited empirical support, the second being the complexity and practicality of the theory, and third, I'll touch on briefly is the culture and cultural and diversity considerations. So what does the research say? So there's many contradictory claims made by the theory. Specifically, one you'll find in the Truscott reading, they talk about the double bind, right? So you have a mother who wants to give her son who has schizophrenia a hug. Uh, when the son hugs her, she reacts in kind of an off-putting way, which gives the son negative emotion. But if she didn't hug him, that would also be negative, and so that results in a double bind. So no matter what he does, he's experiencing something negative. So they argue that that is results in disordered speech and schizophrenia. But I found dozens of studies that actually disprove that. So I found one dating back as early as the 50s, one in 1974. They found methodological problems in that claim, and it prevented empirical verification. And a lot of the issues revolved around retrospective reporting, right? So you're kind of a historian on your own experiences, which is one issue. And they had vague definitions of what a double bind really is. So it's not something that's formally defined. And that was also an issue in kind of proving this idea. In 1965, there was a study that concluded the concept was too ambiguous and unfalsifiable. So it's difficult to prove, but it's also impossible to disprove. So you're in this situation where you can't say it doesn't exist, and you can't really say it does exist. So it's just this kind of gray area of research. In 2006, there was a summary of 50 years of evidence, and they found no reliable empirical support for this double blind theory. Now, as time progresses, we've now shifted towards a more neurocognitive model. So we have different understandings of different disorders. So for schizophrenia specifically, in 2010 and in 2012, they identified working memory, attention, and executive functioning deficits as key contributors to disorganized speech, not double blind. There's no mention of double blind. So it's safe to say that this idea of double blind resulting in disordered speech and schizophrenia is not true. Further, there's a big distinguishing between first order change, which is kind of surface level adjustments that preserve the system structure. I'll talk about it in more detail. And second order change, which are supposed to be deeper transformations that alter the system's rules and patterns. So for example, for what first order change is you're really trying to change the behavior at the surface level. So think of like a punishment. So a teenager is skipping school. Parents respond by grounding the child, and they don't change the actual family behavior pattern. That remains unchanged, right? So you have a problem behavior, you punish that problem behavior, and that's supposed to lead to an outcome of that behavior not occurring again. So systems therapy will argue that you're not changing the family system, so that's not an effective way to actually change the behavior. They talk about second order change, which is instead of focusing on on the defiant teenager, the therapist should help the family see how their interactions create the pattern of the child skipping school, right? And so then you can experiment with new relational patterns, and hopefully that will stop that undesired behavior from occurring. But that is in a systems kind of framework. If you leave that framework and you look at research on parenting, you look at research on changing behaviors, the vast majority focuses and they support the effectiveness of first order change. Okay, so in 2005, I found a study that focused on parent management training that talked about first order change. In 2012, there was a meta-analysis on children with conduct disorder. All of the ways to change the behavior shape their behavior, first order change. In 2010, there was a study on how to reduce aggression in kids. Again, everything focused on first order change. In 2008, uh, there was a study on focusing on compliance and building attachment between family members. Again, first order change. So it seems when you're stuck in this systems therapy landscape, sure, second order change seems the way to go, but when you leave that framework, all of the research points to first order change being the more effective method. So not actually changing the structure of the family, not changing how they're interacting with each other. Actually, you're seeing a behavior you don't like, you punish that behavior, you change that behavior on a first order level. Finally, systems therapy doesn't have the same volume of empirical support as other therapies. So you can think like DBT, CBT. There's nowhere near the same amount of research for systems therapy as there are for other more established therapies. There was one big meta-analysis of systems therapy research in 2024, and what they found was that many studies had inadequate or unclear reporting, and they concluded that there was a high risk of bias in majority of the studies. So they conclude, I think it was about like 84% of the studies that they included in their meta-analysis, they decided had a high risk of bias in those studies. And so they concluded overall the evidence base for systemic therapy in youth is weak due to the low number of studies and methodological shortcomings, such as unclear randomization procedures, lack of blinding, and small sample sizes. So clearly there's issues and gaps in the current body of research. So you have the idea of that they're including, so the Truscott book is a fairly recent textbook, and they're including things that are outdated, have been disproven, and there's gaps in the research, and they're kind of focusing on certain systemic ideas without looking at the broader picture in terms of outside of psychological research, outside of these ideas. Because when you leave that framework, there are other more effective ways to change behavior. The second issue is how difficult it is to provide systems therapy. So family and systems therapy often requires the participation of many family members. Okay, so I found a study from 2012 that found that coordinating schedules for all family members is a substantial challenge. And then beyond logistics, not all family members are willing to participate or even see the value in therapy. Okay, so if you have a group of family members, all family members have to be present. They all have to buy into the therapy. And you can imagine how difficult that can be. You have to have every single family member on board and ready to participate, join in for every session, and actually buy into the ideas of therapy. In 2020, there was a study that found that resistance from just one member, so just if one family member doesn't value the therapy, isn't bought in, that can undermine the process and reduce gains from therapy. In juvenile or child welfare cases that involve forced participation of families, they found that that leads to superficial engagement. So if you're court ordered to attend a therapy, you're not going to actually buy in and have the idea that you want to change and want to actually engage in the therapy. So if you don't have the actual buy-in, it's going to reduce the effectiveness of the therapy. Okay, so clearly there needs to be a lot of buy-in across family members for systems therapy to be effective. Further, systems therapy is grounded in systems theory, which posits that individuals cannot be understood in isolations of the system that they're a part of. So while this conceptual foundation is a strength in many ways, it also introduces a level of clinical complexity that can serve as a barrier to widespread implementation and effective training. Unlike individual focused therapies like CBT, systems therapy requires therapists to think in terms of reciprocal causality, homeostasis, triangulation, multi-generational transmission processes, system boundary regulations. So these are all those fancy terms that come with being a systems therapy therapist. Uh, and you can imagine the level of training, understanding, uh, the level of work it would take to be competent to provide this kind of therapy. So a study in 2020 found that these constructs challenge clinicians to continually access interactions and relational properties rather than linear cause and effect relationships. Okay, there's also a lack of standardization in systems models. So therapies like CBT, DBT have widely accepted manuals, competencies, and certification pathways, whereas systems therapy does not. This poses a training and fidelity challenge because systems therapy requires skills that are not easily acquired in brief graduate courses or practicum placements, right? So I can imagine if I can't find any systems therapist in my city, you're not going to be able to find someone who's going to supervise you and train you on systems therapy. It's going to be a very difficult thing to find, and it's going to be a very long road to become proficient in it. So finally, many community mental health settings, especially those under pressure to deliver brief, manualized care, may lack access to the specialized supervision, limiting opportunities for novice therapists to develop systemic competence, right? So, for example, I work at a hospital that provides mental health supports. No one there does systemic therapy because they prioritize very quick turnarounds, right? So, models like CBT, DBT, clear time frame, clear approaches, it's manualized, they can come in and be efficient with it. Regardless of how effective, they want that kind of model. A systems model is going to be very long, very drawn out, requires very specific expertise, and that's not going to be funded, it's not going to be supported. And then finally, to touch on it briefly, when you think about cultural considerations, this idea is based on a very Western idea of the family. And so when you have different cultures, so let's say you look at Asian cultures, where there is a strict adherence to certain hierarchies. Uh, sorry, give me one. There's a strict adherence to certain hierarchies. Those kind of systems are going to be resistant to change, right? So typically in Asian cultures, there's a hierarchy where grandparents are first, parents, children, right? The parents are going to be respectful to the grandparents, the children are respectful to the parents, the grandparents, and so on. Western ideas may be different where, maybe the parent has to bend towards a child, but that's not going to fly in certain cultures. So it's a very specific approach to very certain cultures, which is another drawback to the systems therapy. And that's my part.
Okay. First of all, Jeremy, that was amazing. You are the perfect person to discuss the whole philosophical basis of systemic therapy. That was very in-depth. I remember our first meeting for this presentation and how it took like us literally an hour and a half to just wrap our heads around this therapy and what it was all about. And Julian, I love that you brought up a lot of the criticisms of systemic therapy because actually I have some of the opposite research that I found. And I have to say that I'm kind of disappointed that you're saying that second order change doesn't work as well as first order change because I like the thought of treating something deeper, right? Not just the surface behaviors. Like some of the criticisms of behaviorism is that we're just getting kids to act the way we want to on the surface and we're not treating anything deeper. Um, so I'm not convinced that it doesn't work. I do also like that it treats the person with the disorder as it stops blaming, I guess, and shaming them maybe for saying this disorder is within you. It's actually being maintained by people around you as well, and it invites everyone into that conversation. So say someone with schizophrenia like that, as we now know, it's more of a brain-based thing, but it really takes the focus off of them, which I kind of like. So I tend to come from a more CBT mindset. I kind of like CBT, but and I actually thought I would hate systemic therapy. I really did, but I kind of like it. But I can see the problems as well. So my question is maybe, well, for both of you, my thought was, so if you're treating the person, or sorry, if you're treating the system that the person is in rather than the system, or sorry, rather than the person, uh, what happens if that person changes systems, right? So from a CBT mindset, you're treating someone with anxiety. You're not giving them any more, or you are giving them tools to learn how to deal with that anxiety, relaxation training, changing your thinking and your behaviors. But once that person is in any other system or any other context, they can still use those skills. But for systemic therapy, the problem would be is if that person suddenly enters a new system, they don't have those skills. So I don't know if you guys have any thoughts about that.
So, like, just to clarify your question, so like the idea is that okay, if someone learns how to adapt within the system,
Hmm.
and then they enter a new system, because the therapy was done with the system, and you stick them in a new system where the therapy wasn't done, will
Hmm.
change last, or what would the impact be on that individual?
Yeah, exactly. You've got all these people involved, like a whole family maybe involved in the therapy, but once that person enters a new system, like say they move off to college and now they have friends, and that those people don't know how to treat or yeah, if
You
you know
know
what I'm
what, from like
saying.
an emergence perspective, you know that little thing that I made where you can see the family can stay in homeostasis, they can go up or they can go down as a system. I could see somebody potentially staying the same, or becoming disorganized because those elements that were like kind of developed within the family system aren't available in the new system. I
Mhm.
could see that happening. And I could also see someone seeking the proper resources from a systemic standpoint. Where do I go? Who do I talk to? Who do I reach out to? From like a, from a learning disability standpoint, with the kids that we work with, when we send them back to the homeschool, we teach them how to reach out to the teachers and advocate with their IEP. Like we teach them how to kind of approach the system to make sure that the system, you know what I mean, benefits them. And I'm wondering, because I think you're right, how would someone that doesn't know how to do that, how could they benefit in a new system where it's gone?
Mhm.
So I think, yeah, it's a good question. I would expect that it's a consideration that you should have. People move from systems. There's other systems. They're in this system. We seem to have got homeostasis or they've adapted well here, but they're going to a new system. How do you prepare for that?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's good, but there's also that question of how does someone function in a new system for sure. I kind of like systems therapy too, for one other reason, because um, Truscott mentions this actually in the textbook, where the focus is more on helping people have a better quality of life while living with their disorder. So again, it's not treating the person, but say a disorder is very hard to treat, like schizophrenia. How do we help that person have a overall better quality of life while the symptoms are persisting right now, if we can't get those symptoms cured or ameliorated? Yeah.
Can I jump in real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
And there was a point that you like what you just brought up, and also Julian, you brought this up as well in terms of like getting everybody engaged can be something that maintains the difficulty. And I've seen this firsthand from a treatment perspective, where you would have 10 counselors that are on the same page, they're applying the therapy the exact same way, but then you have one member that's in the node that for whatever reason, if it's a relational thing, they feel bad for the kid, it's hard for them to kind of enact the treatment program that we're running, and they are failing to follow through in that. And you could see, especially someone with conduct disorder, that was the node that they would seek out, and everything would be undone. Everything, they'd be like, oh, I can map out everybody that's on the same page, but I see this person over here is not on the same page, and I can get my maladaptive needs met through that person. And so I was just that it made me think about that, just combining those two thoughts together.
Hmm.
And the
Good
sense I get
points.
too is that it seems like a very like utopian therapy, right? It works if everything is perfect,
Hmm.
but you
Hmm.
we're living in a world where that's never going to happen. And you brought up that interesting point of moving systems, right? So yeah, like what's going to happen when they get a career, get a job? They're going
Hmm.
to be in a system that's definitely not going to bend towards them. They're going to have to then again look inside and change themselves to kind of conform to those systems, right? And so that's why it's a problem with the therapy. And I think individually focused therapy is more effective at treating those issues as opposed to something like systems therapy, because you're going to get into situations where the systems aren't going to bend, they're not going to change.
Right. Exactly. I think speaking to changing topics, Julian, how you mentioned something, how it's kind of hard to find good quality studies on systemic therapy. I did find some. So there were two articles in particular that were from Germany, and the goal of these authors were to convince the German healthcare system that it's a valid therapy and you can cover it, cover the expense of it. And they pulled together, it was how many? 85 trials, 85 studies. 75 of them showed that it was effective for things like conduct disorder, you mentioned delinquency, ADHD, substance use disorders, um, eating disorders, mood disorders, somatic illnesses. And so they separated these into two categories, so externalizing and internalizing disorders. And it's been used across the world, like Europe, the US, China. So there are studies that work, but again, you mentioned how a lot of these studies are biased. Well, perhaps these researchers were biased as well because they're trying to make a point. They're trying to prove that it works. Um, but where was I going with this? Yeah, so there is evidence, but obviously it's not as popular anymore. Some of the articles as well, it's hard to find articles that are just pure systemic therapy because now we have CBT family therapy. We have even the Trust Talk chapter on person-centered therapy uses family therapy as well. And that term is so confused. It's not necessarily systemic therapy just because it's given the name family therapy. And I remember we had this discussion earlier. I wanted to bring this up about when we're treating OCD, it's traditionally treated with exposure and response prevention, which is a CBT method. Um, but you also involve families. So you're treating families about what family accommodation is and how the reactions you give your child or whoever it is um, can reinforce their behavior. And that's kind of similar to systems therapy, but kind of different. So, do you have any thoughts about how to distinguish those? Maybe using that example. Like, how do we tell that it's CBT family therapy, not systemic therapy?
From what I know about CBT, you're changing your thoughts. So you have a belief and you challenge that belief, and that results in a new thought. So whether you're including a family in that, it's probably still individuals changing themselves, right? So let's say
Yeah.
the example I gave with a child skipping school, maybe it's like I have a view that when I get angry, I skip school for whatever reason, but then I have to figure out a way to internalize the idea that that's not the most effective reason or not the most effective thing to do when I have these emotions, right? Whereas systems therapy will find a new way to kind of have the people interact so that that doesn't happen.
So with family accommodation, what happens is the child is maybe seeking reassurance for their OCD fears, and they're doing that over and over and over again. But the parent might be accommodating that and giving the child that reassurance. And so it's kind of similar.
I think that that's it's such a good question of how to separate the two. I think that's probably why you get this iteration where you have like systemic therapy with CBT mixed. Is they were probably realizing that, hey, I'm going to do the CBT with this person at an individual level, but I'm seeing that these symptoms are being reinforced at home because it's difficult for someone who's like, obviously emotionally attached to their child. There's a lot of suffering that comes along with the anxiety, right? And so you know, you might be uncomfortable with, maybe there's some homework around, hey, next time so and so seeks reassurance, you can't give it.
Hmm.
You have to stop
Exactly.
it, right? And then to me, that's the systemic part. That's a system part.
Right.
That's when as a therapist you're like, okay, like here's my individual view. Now I got to switch. Um, uh, and this like these types of situation is where I don't really agree with the Truscott textbook in like not liking an eclectic approach. It doesn't make
Hmm.
sense to me because it's weird, because it's like, systemic therapy is like, okay, like you have this node, but you should pay attention to all the other nodes and that they matter. And it's kind of like, well, that's the same thing with therapies. Like you have one therapy, but you have all these other therapies, and all these other therapies can interact in a good way for an individual client, right? So
Hmm.
for me, I would probably be doing like the shifting in my head. Here's my individual perspective. We got to work here with this person on an individual level, and now I have a systemic problem. And maybe a systemic therapy or a systemic viewpoint will help me to at least identify and characterize the patterns from a systemic view, and then apply an intervention there. But then you'd end up in an
Yes.
individual situation where you're working with that individual and you're helping them through their anxiety of not helping the kid with the reassurance. So then it's not really systemic, it's individualized, which I think
I know.
you've done that, Julian, a little bit. So looking at the system, working individually back at the system, and I don't know. Anyways.
And I think that's why we don't find systemic therapists anymore. So one of the reasons is because a lot of the theories about just treating people, treating the groups of people around the people have been taken on by other theories, right? So maybe we don't need this huge understanding of the deep philosophical roots of systemic theory, but we do have to understand that families are involved with people, and it's okay that we're mixing therapies a little bit. We're taking kind of the best of and incorporating it all together. Um, I'm just going to pull up, I know we're running out of time here. We're actually way over time, but I'm just going to pull up one quick slide I have and share an article, points from an article that we wanted to get the class to discuss. So if you can see this. Okay, so sorry, we're going to go forward to here. So there's an article, actually, it's very recent, 2025, that tried to boil down what systemic therapy actually is. They talked about a systemic stance, which is the ways of being that a therapist has to have. You can read them on the screen there, as well as systemic skills, ways of doing, techniques and things to follow during therapy. And it's very complex. As you can see, if you read the article in depth, it's very complex, which is why it, like Julian said, it's hard to train. It's hard to get into this kind of therapy. And this is just 12 points. And the authors were boiling it down. So it's also obviously very complex. So you'll see in one of our questions that we want you as a class to take one of these points and figure out how you can apply that to your future careers as school psychologists. And we'll maybe leave our presentation at that. Julian, Jeremie, any other points before we close?
I just want to say that I really like this format. It was fun
It was fun.
go and like seek out research and then come back and go, hey, look, this is what I found. And so I enjoyed
Mhm.
that, and I hope that everybody else enjoys that as well.
Agreed.
Hope so too. Okay, thanks everyone.